A social construct is a theory of knowledge that examines the development of jointly constructed understandings of the world that form the basis for shared assumptions about reality. It is something that exists not in objective reality, but is the result of human interactions that form the basis for shared assumptions about reality. People in society construct ideas that may not exist without the presence of people or language to validate these concepts. Knowledge and belief of what our shared reality is become embedded in the institutional fabric of society. Reality is therefore said to be socially constructed. An example of a social construct is money, or the concept of currency, as people in society have agreed to give it importance and value. For this class, we're going to explore the social constructs of culture, gender, race, history, and explore the idea of art, what is music, and ultimately answer the question, what is art music?
Most of the time, the things we experience in this world are just constructs. We have opinions about everything, and we experience the world through that lens. Social constructionism is a theory that knowledge and many aspects of the world around us are not real in and of themselves. They only exist because we give them reality through social agreement. Things like nations, books, even money don't exist in the absence of human society. Nations are groups of people who happen to share a language or history. Books are paper with scribbles. And money is just pieces of paper and metal that have no value other than what we have assigned them. The concept of the self can be considered a social construct too. Our identity is created by interactions with other people and our reactions to the expectations of society.
Culture encompasses the social behavior and norms found in human societies. It is anything people make or do. Humans acquire culture through the learning process and through socialization. This is illustrated by the diversity of peoples and their ways of life across societies. Culture can also be thought of as not only a possession, but something that occurs between people. As we will see, cultural practice as well as definitions of culture are constantly evolving. For this class, to define culture, we are going to take a look at 4 prominent anthropologists and their work. Our first anthropologist is E.B. Tylor. His definition of culture was published in 1871. He wrote, "Culture, or civilization, taken in its broad ethnographic sense, is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society." By using the word acquired, we know that E.B. Tylor believed that culture is something that we possess. Tylor believed in equality of individuals, but he did not believe in equality of societies. Tylor was a big fan of Charles Darwin, and Tylor believed that societies evolved from simple to complex and placed value on their relative proximity to industrialization. This idea reinforces the idea that technology is the measure of man or the measure of society. Let's go over a few pages of Tylor's book, Primitive Culture, published in 1871, to give you an idea of what he's writing. Tylor wrote, "Culture, or civilization, taken in its wide ethnographic sense, is that complex whole which includes knowledge, beliefs, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. The condition of culture among the various societies of mankind, insofar as it is capable of being investigated on general principles, is a subject apt for the study of law of human thought and action. On the one hand, the uniformity which so largely pervades civilization may be ascribed in great measure to the uniform action of uniform causes, while on the other hand, its various grades may be regarded as stages of development or evolution, each the outcome of previous history, and about to do its proper part in shaping the history of the future. To the investigation of these two great principles in several departments of ethnography, with especial consideration to the civilization of the lower tribes as related to the civilization of the higher nations, the present volumes are devoted. In taking up the problem of the development of culture as a branch of ethnological research, a first proceeding is to obtain a means of measurement. Seeking something like a definite line along which to reckon progression and retrogression in civilization, we may apparently find it best in the classification of real tribes and nations, past and present. Civilization actually existing among mankind in different grades, we are enabled to estimate and compare it by positive examples. The educated world of Europe and America practically settles a standard by simply placing its own nations at one end of the social series and savage tribes at the other, arranging the rest of mankind between these limits, according as they correspond more closely to savage or to cultured life. The principal criteria of classification are the absence or presence, high or low development of the industrial arts, especially metalworking, manufacture of implements and vessels, agriculture, architecture, etc., the extent of scientific knowledge, the definiteness of moral principles, the condition of religious belief and ceremony, the degree of social and political organization, and so forth. Thus, on the definite basis of compared facts, ethnographers are able to set up at least a rough scale of civilization. Few would dispute that the following races are arranged rightly in order of culture: Australian, Tahitian, Aztec, Chinese, Italian. These ideas support Western dominance, support colonial occupation, as well as other forms of subjugation and exploitation. Jumping into the 1940s and 1950s with Claude Lévi-Strauss and structural anthropology. Structural anthropology is based on the idea that immutable deep structures exist in all cultures, and consequently that all cultural practices have counterparts in other cultures with historical ancestry. Essentially, he's saying that all cultures are equatable. Claude Lévi-Strauss is regarded as the father of structural anthropology. In the 1940s, he proposed that the proper focus of anthropological investigations should be on the underlying patterns of human thought that produce the cultural categories that organize worldviews. He believed that these processes do not determine culture, but instead operated within culture. He derived the concept of binary oppositions, which became fundamental in his theory. He proposed that culture, like language, is composed of hidden rules that govern the behavior of its practitioners. What makes cultures unique and different from one another are the hidden rules participants understand but are unable to articulate. Thus, the goal of structural anthropology is to identify these rules. Lévi-Strauss proposed that the structure of human thought processes is the same in all cultures, and that these mental processes exist in the form of binary oppositions. Some of these oppositions include hot-cold, male-female, and culture-nature. Anthropologists may discover underlying thought processes by examining such things as kinship, myth, and language. Structuralism assumes the universality of human thought processes in an effort to explain the underlying meaning existing in culture.
Structuralism. I'm not going to talk about structuralism as a whole. I'm going to talk about structuralist anthropology. So it's not going to be quite the same as a structuralist reading of mythology or of linguistics. Now, structuralism existed before the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, but he was the one who brought it into anthropology. Essentially, structuralist anthropology makes the claim that all cultures and all societies have similar structures within them that are comparable and equivalent and homologous. That certainly makes it easy to compare cultures, doesn't it? But how fair is it to the cultures that are being compared? Well, yes, certain cultures can be compared easily because they are similar or they are related, for example, the United States and the United Kingdom, or the United States and Canada. But what about a comparison of a cultural group in Zambia and a cultural group in China? Structuralists would argue that all cultures have these similar structures in them. Family, kinship group, community, overall society, government, maybe educational systems. There are also lots of critiques of structuralism out there. Let me present to you two. Critique number one, ahistorical. Many anthropologists argue that structuralism ignores the historical context behind the creation of the structures they wish to study. Two cultures that are totally unrelated to each other can have similar structures that developed in different ways, from different reasons and from different roots, but now look similar and serve similar purposes. Think, for example, about bird wings, bat wings, and the wings of a pterosaur, like a pterodactyl. These three types of creatures developed separately, developed independently, and developed differently. But they all developed wings that served the same purpose: flight. But if you x-ray those wings, their internal bone structures look different. Similarly, if you were to look very closely at the historical context of two similar structures in two different cultures, you would find different roots and different contexts. Critique number 2. Structuralism ignores the inherent difference and individuality of cultures. When looking to compare two or more cultures, you're always going to be looking for similarities. But you have to ensure that those similarities are actually there and that you're not just creating them because you're seeing what you want to see, which some people think is what's going on with structuralism. It's important to keep both of these critiques in mind when deciding whether to use a structuralist analysis. One more cautionary note. If you do use a structuralist analysis, be sure that the structures you're analyzing are actually present in the cultures you're analyzing, and that you're not just taking structures from your own culture and imposing them on a different one. The thing about structuralism is that it's a tool, not a belief system, so it doesn't always have to be right. You will likely find many situations wherein structuralism is very useful to you. You will also likely find many situations in which it is inherently unhelpful. The choice of when to use it is all yours.
In short, structural anthropology would be interested in looking at the deep structures that all cultures share, such as the family unit or conflict resolution. The problem is it's not always a good idea to directly compare two cultures. Moving on to Geertz. Geertz himself argues for a semiotic concept of culture, believing with Max Weber that man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun. He states, "I take culture to be those webs, and the analysis of it to be therefore not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning. It is explication I am after, construing social expression on their surface, enigmatical." You might think back to Tylor. Tylor was clearly looking for law. Geertz was an anthropologist who is remembered mostly for his ideas regarding symbolic anthropology, a framework which gives prime attention to the role of symbols in constructing meaning. He was one of the earliest scholars to see that the insights provided by common language and philosophy could be a major explanatory force in understanding a people's culture. In his book, The Interpretation of Cultures, published in 1973, Geertz outlined culture as a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms by means of which men communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about and attitudes towards life. Geertz aimed to provide the social sciences with an understanding and appreciation of what he called thick description. A thick description results from a scientific observation of any particular human behavior that describes not just the behavior, but the context as well, so that the behavior can be better understood by an outsider. A thick description typically adds a record of subjective explanations and meanings provided by the people engaged in the behaviors, making the collected data of greater value for studies by other social scientists. Geertz applied thick description to anthropological studies, urging anthropologists to consider the limitations placed upon them by their own cultural universe when attempting to offer insight into the cultures of other people.
How do we understand other cultures? Even more difficult, how do we understand other cultures from other times? How do we get into the minds of others? There is a misconception about history and the social sciences that assumes that when you read a source, a document, or a study of a different culture, the truth will arise out of it, that the sources will speak to you. But the difficulty arises when we acknowledge that research always begins with preconceptions, tools and language moulded through our own culture and societal ideas. Does this then confuse the results, skew the research towards our own agenda, however unintentional? How do we avoid this difference of perspective? The anthropologist Clifford Geertz, arguably the greatest anthropologist of the 20th century, had an influential answer. He called it thick description. Geertz had a prominent influence on what came to be known as the cultural turn in the humanities, a move away from looking at large social structures, economic systems, or forms of politics and government, towards immediate culture as a prime mover of history. Through this lens, people can't be understood just through economic ideas like a rational cost-benefit analysis, or through studying how they were governed, or through an analysis of the means of production, or by assuming that philosophy meant the same for the philosophe of Enlightenment France as it did for someone in modern-day Bali. To understand people, you had to look closely at their culture. There are no total definitions or supreme theories, or a general theory of cultural interpretation. Geertz said that man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun. To understand people, you have to understand the webs. He said that, though ideational, culture does not exist in someone's head. Though unphysical, it is not an occult entity. It is an intersubjective map of meaning that helps guide actions. Importantly for Geertz, culture is semiotic, a system of signs, codes and symbols, linguistic, pictorial, performative, gestures, norms, that create meaning between them. Because the meaning is made between them, with no overarching universal idea of culture that determines that meaning, to understand any given culture, you have to get in amongst it. To take a simplified example, an alien wouldn't understand 90s America just by watching Forrest Gump and entering the lines into their alien supercomputer. They'd have to understand politics, love, war, Hollywood. They'd have to come down and study the interconnecting themes. Geertz uses the example of two boys winking rapidly. One has a twitch, the other is winking to a friend. Both look the same, but the second can only be understood to be different through knowing the social code of winking, the idea of a joke, the event he is winking about, or the biological and psychological pathology that causes the twitch. A simple observation requires understanding a web of meaning, a thick description. For Geertz, you don't study a village, you study in a village. Interpreting cultures means looking at the minutiae of events and drawing upwards towards larger conclusions about the cohesiveness of culture.
Moving on to Agar. Michael Agar was active in the 1990s and is very much in the Geertz camp. Agar believed that we need to abandon the word culture altogether because it will never be rid of Tylor's baggage. So he proposed the term languaculture because you cannot separate, according to Agar, you cannot separate language from culture. When Agar talks about languaculture, he defines it as the necessary tie between language and culture. He underlines that languages and cultures are always closely related and it is not possible to distinguish languages from cultures. Therefore, you cannot really know a language if you do not also know the culture expressed by the language. So another thing I really appreciate about Agar is he looks at culture as not only a possession, but also a happening. When we were going over Tylor, I mentioned that Tylor believes that culture is something that we have. I have culture, you have culture. But Agar also looks at it as something that can happen between people. So let's imagine that we're talking about cars. And as we're having this discussion, we're using the word car, but I'm imagining a Toyota Tercel, and you're imagining a Camaro. So we get into an argument because we're not in agreement on what exactly a car is. So instead of looking at it as I have my culture of Toyota Tercel and you have your culture of Camaro, what if we were to imagine that we just experienced a cultural happening? Now with this idea, we have something in common. We've shared an experience, as opposed to approaching it as you have your culture and I have my culture. The following is an excerpt from Agar's book, Language Shock, published in 1994. Culture is something those people have, but it's more than that. It's also something that happens to you when you encounter them. As long as they're just out there, just a different group of folks, you won't have to deal with them. When you deal with them, culture turns personal. Culture is no longer just what some group has, it's what happens to you when you encounter differences. Become aware of something in yourself and work to figure out why the differences appeared. Culture is an awareness, a consciousness, one that reveals the hidden self and opens paths to other ways of being. In conclusion, culture is a social construct. It's what an individual acquires after being born into a society. It's that complex whole, including religion, social order, the arts, etc. It's the way of life of a particular group of people. It's the web of meaning that creates social cohesion. It's what a group of people agree on and agree to disagree on. Culture may not be separated from language, etc. Moving on to gender. Gender is also a social construct. Judith Butler argues that gender is socially constructed through commonplace speech acts and nonverbal communication that are performative, and that they serve to define and maintain identities. Performativity views actions, behaviors, and gestures as both the result of an individual's identity as well as a source that contributes to the formation of one's identity, which is continuously being redefined through speech acts and symbolic communication. My identity is not simply that of a teacher. I am performing what I think a teacher is, and you are also performing me being a teacher. All of this contributes to my identity of a teacher. Gender identity is not synonymous with sexual identity nor biological sex. Gender, thought of as a fixed binary, is socially constructed. Though sex categorization is based on biological sex, it is maintained as a category through socially constructed displays of gender. Gender is performed and performative. The following is a quote from Judith Butler. When we say that gender is performed, we usually mean that we've taken on a role. We're acting in some way. For something to be performative means that it produces a series of effects. We act as if being that of a man or that of being of a woman is actually an internal reality or simply something that is true about us. Actually, it is a phenomenon that is being produced all the time and reproduced all the time. Thus, gender is constructed through a set of acts that are said to be in compliance with dominant societal norms. Now let's watch a short video of Judith Butler explaining this further.
It's one thing to say that gender is performed, and that's a little different from saying gender is performative. When we say gender is performed, we usually mean that we've taken on a role, we're acting in some way, and that our acting or our role playing is crucial to the gender that we are and the gender that we present to the world. To say that gender is performative is a little different, because for something to be performative means that it produces a series of effects. We act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. You know, I was walking down the street in Berkeley when I first arrived several years ago, and a young woman who was, I think, in high school leaned out of her window and she yelled, "Are you a lesbian?" And she was looking to harass me. Or maybe she was just freaked out, or she thought I looked like I probably was one and wanted to know. But instead I just turned around and I said, yes, I am. And that really shocked her. We act as if that being of a man or that being of a woman is actually an internal reality or something that's simply true about us, a fact about us. Actually, it's a phenomenon that's being produced all the time and reproduced all the time. So to say gender is performative is to say that nobody really is a gender from the start. I know it's controversial, but that's my claim.
That can be a lot to take in, so I'm going to give you another example. We typically dress today boy babies in blue and girl babies in pink. And this is done as a way of indicating to society their biological sex and their presumed gender. But just a century ago, it was more common for boy babies to wear pink and girl babies to wear blue. We're going to watch a short video now of a little girl in a toy store reacting against social pressure for her to behave as a consumer in a particular way. And I think it all makes sense when you see her reaction.
Would it be fair for all the girls to buy princesses and all the boys to buy superheroes?
Well, why?
Because the girls want superheroes and the boys want superheroes, and the girls want pink stuff and the boys don't want pink stuff. Yeah.
Boys want both, but why did you think they do that?
Because the companies who make these try to trick the girls into buying the pink stuff instead of stuff that boys want to buy, right?
Right, but you can buy either, right? And boys can buy either. If boys want to buy pink, they can buy pink, right?
Yeah, so then why do all the girls have to buy princesses? Some girls like superheroes, some girls like princesses.
Yeah,
some boy like superheroes, some boy like princesses.
absolutely.
So
You're absolutely right.
Why does all the girls have to buy pink stuff and all the boys have to buy different color stuff?
It's a good question, Riley.
In this class, history is the study of the past as it is described in written documents. In other words, history can refer to the academic discipline which uses a narrative to examine and analyze a sequence of past events and objectively determine the patterns of cause and effect that determine them. History can also be understood as an umbrella term that relates to past events, as well as to the memory, discovery, collection, organization, presentation, and interpretation of information about these events. In other words, history is not the past. History is a narrative about the past. What is art? We have pictured here 4 different works of art that represent very different artistic values. On the left is David. David is a Renaissance sculpture created by Michelangelo. It is a 17-foot marble statue that represents the biblical hero David, a favorite subject in the art of Florence. It was unveiled on September 8th, 1504. On the bottom, we have Fountain. It is a 1917 work produced by Marcel Duchamp. The piece was a porcelain urinal, which was signed R. Mutt. Submitted for the exhibition of the Society of Independent Artists in 1917, the work is regarded by art historians and theorists of the avant-garde, such as Peter Berger, as a major landmark in 20th century art. Philosopher Stephen Hicks argued that Duchamp, who was quite familiar with the history of European art, was obviously making a provocative statement with Fountain. Hicks states that the artist is not a great creator. Duchamp went shopping at a plumbing store. The artwork is not a special object. It was mass-produced in a factory. Duchamp did not select just any ready-made object to display. In selecting the urinal, his message was clear. Art is something you piss on. Top center, we have Campbell's soup cans, which is sometimes referred to as 32 Campbell's soup cans. It is a work of art produced in 1962 by Andy Warhol. The individual paintings were produced by a semi-mechanized printmaking method. The combination of the semi-mechanized process and the commercial subject initially caused offense, as the work's blatantly mundane commercialism represented a direct affront to the technique and philosophy of abstract expressionism. On the right, we have an example of a Mambila figure from Nigeria. Most African sculpture was historically in wood and other natural materials. Mambila figures embody ancestors who, according to their beliefs, are responsible for the community's wealth. The figures appear with bent legs and typically enlarged heads outlined in wood pegs. In Western African art, there is often a widespread emphasis on expressive individualism while simultaneously being influenced by the work of predecessors. There is an emphasis on the human figure, and African artwork tends to favor visual abstraction over naturalistic representation. There is often a utilitarian element with traditional African art. Much of it is crafted for use in performance contexts rather than in static ones. For example, traditional African masks and costumes are often used in communal, ceremonial contexts where they are danced. So with such diverse examples, we are perhaps still wondering, what is art? I like the idea that art is an expression or application of human creative skill and imagination. Leo Tolstoy, in his essay, What is Art?, published in 1897, wrote, "Art is not, as the metaphysicians say, the manifestation of some mysterious idea of beauty or God. It is not, as the aesthetical physiologists say, a game in which man lets off his excess of stored-up energy. It is not the expression of man's emotions by external signs. It is not the production of pleasing objects, and above all, it is not pleasure. But it is a means of union among men, joining them together in the same feelings and indispensable for the life and progress towards well-being of individuals and of humanity." I think that's beautiful, and I would like you all to keep that in mind and apply that idea to music, is it's a means of bringing people together. Moving on to music. What is music? This topic could take an entire class, but I've selected just one that I think is very concise, by John Blacking, published in 1973. He writes, "Music is humanly organized sound." I think it's a great definition. Some students have asked, what about birds or whales? Are they not producing music? And my response would be, I don't know. I've never been able to ask a bird or a whale if what they're producing is music. In that scenario, we are essentially imposing our values on these animals by assuming that what they are producing is music. Now that we've agreed on a definition of music, let's look at music and social function. Thomas Torino breaks music into two categories: participatory music and presentational music. With participatory music, everyone present is actively doing something. They can be playing an instrument, singing, or chanting, or dancing. There would not be a clear distinction in this scenario between the audience and the performer. With presentational music, there is a clear divide between the performers and the audience. Audience members might sing or dance and sing along, but they are not the focus. You might think of a Western classical performance or a South Asian classical performance. With presentational music, you might have the performers on an elevated stage, so you have a clear distinction between the two groups. There is literally a line drawn between the performers and the audience. presentational music might have the audience sitting quietly and listening, and you might get some participation at the end that is an applause. No music performance is entirely participatory nor entirely presentational, but certainly different performances or practices or traditions will favor one over the other. Moving on to art music. This actually is the point that inspired the last 40 minutes. This idea of art music is why I felt it necessary to spend 40 minutes discussing social constructs. If we look at the syllabus, the first thing it says is an arts appreciation course. And then as we read the course description, it says an introductory study of the visual, literary, dramatic, and musical arts, which includes approaches to understanding the arts and consideration of the roles of artistic expression in human cultures. I felt that the content of the course did not adequately cover artistic expression in human cultures. Your definition for art music given in your textbook reads, music intended for careful attention to its sounds and expressive qualities. I think this is a great definition. The issue I have is that your book then goes on to just give you a history and analysis of European classical music. So what it implies is that European classical music is music intended for careful attention to its sounds and expressive qualities. And I would agree with that. I think European classical music is wonderful and beautiful, but to make that statement and then not include any other traditions is a problem. The world's a big place, and there are many musics worth careful attention. The next definition is music created for the intellectual and psychological satisfaction it provides is referred to as art music, concert music, or classical music. That sounds nice. It's I don't know. That's kind of a vague definition. I'm not quite sure what is being said there. The next definition is from Wikipedia, and this definition, I believe, really outlines some issues. Art music, also known as Western classical music, cultivated music, serious music, canonic music, or more flippantly, real music, and normal music, is an umbrella term that refers to musical traditions implying advanced structural and theoretical considerations and a written musical tradition. The main tradition in the Western world is usually called classical music. Serious or cultivated music are terms frequently used as a contrast for ordinary, everyday music, popular and folk music, also called vernacular music. After the 20th century, art music was divided into two extensions, serious music and light music. Okay. When I read that, I see Tylor. If you think back to our first anthropologist discussed, E.B. Tylor, he gave us this wonderful definition of culture, but then as we went and read the first few pages of his book, it became clear that Tylor believed in a hierarchy of societies, with European and Western cultures at one end of the spectrum being very cultivated, and other traditions that were less industrialized, that are perhaps hunting and gathering or more agrarian cultures, would be at the savage end of the spectrum. This obviously creates a bias with preference towards Western traditions. And when I read this definition of art music, it sounds to me to contain a lot of these biased ideas about culture. Let's read it one more time, imagining Tylor. And you might go back and read a little bit of Tylor if you need a refresher. Art music, also known as Western classical music, cultivated music, serious music, canonic music, or more flippantly, real music and normal music, is an umbrella term that refers to musical traditions implying advanced structural and theoretical considerations and a written tradition. The main tradition in Western world is usually called classical music. Serious or cultivated music are terms frequently used as a contrast for ordinary, everyday music, popular and folk music, also called vernacular music. After the 20th century, art music was divided in two extensions, serious music and light music. Okay, so ordinary, everyday music, popular and folk music. I take issue with this idea of ordinary, everyday music. This feeds into this narrative of industrialization and technology being the measure of a people. There's nothing ordinary or everyday about Leadbelly. I don't see anything ordinary about music produced by Muddy Waters or Stevie Ray Vaughan or Radiohead. This idea that this music is serious or cultivated, and Leadbelly is not serious or cultivated, I see that as a problem.